Good morning. This is the Trent England Show. Welcome to the new show. This is the new program. If you're a radio listener, welcome. I'm glad you crossed over to the video side with us, or maybe you're listening to the podcast later on and sticking with audio. That's fine too. We are live on Facebook and live on YouTube, and also in all our usual haunts on iTunes and SoundCloud, and over at ocpathink.org, where our entire show archive lives. You can go back and find years of the Trent England Show that way. But I'm glad to be here with you. I mean, can you believe we're still operating? The government, the federal government is shut down, but somehow we're still able to. I mean, are you shut down? There are cars driving around outside. I mean, traffic wasn't any light. I mean, look, I know that there are families out there in Oklahoma in particular and around the country who are civilian contractors for the military, who work in the federal government in other capacities, who are furloughed and without pay. Typically, they get all of their back pay, and it actually becomes. Still, it's not a wonderful thing to have your paycheck delayed, right? But typically, what these things become is essentially extra paid vacation, because usually the full bill is paid back, right? And that is important to understand and recognize. Some of the rhetoric gets overheated, and frankly, some of the rhetoric is just totally disingenuous about the government shutdown and its effects. But hey, most of the country is still operating. I pointed this out last week. I mean, this is a challenge for conservatives, because it's a messaging challenge, because you don't want to go out there and celebrate the fact that you don't want to celebrate something that does make some people's lives harder. And this is where, I get frustrated with some of my fellow conservatives who say, government shutdown, hooray, it's wonderful. Look, it is tough on some people. But at the end of the day, it is also an opportunity to explain to folks that, look, I mean, isn't it interesting that when you shut down non-essential federal government, I mean, there's a lot of non-essential federal government agencies and programs and functions, and some things that get shut down are important and are legitimate, constitutionally allowed, and therefore legal. But there's a lot of things that aren't happening today, especially in Washington, D.C., more than out around the rest of the country in places like Oklahoma, but especially in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of things that the federal government is not doing today that it should never do. And hey, I think that's legitimate to point out. The House Democrats held a press conference, I think yesterday, to talk about the whole shutdown. We have that video. Can we roll that video?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Yesterday, hundreds of thousands of women and their friends and men poured into the streets to champion the values of American.
I am not going to, no, I hope you haven't, I'm not going to make you watch that. I'm sorry. I wanted to play that just to make the point. I mean, look, there were protests all around the country over the weekend against the Trump administration. They still happened, right? Life goes on. I mean, it's kind of funny, right? Life goes on, and everything that the left wants to say about this shutdown is pitted against the fact that, I mean, look, they're out. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, she's still doing her thing, and people marched across the country, trying frankly to maintain the momentum on the far left into the election, because typically the far left does not turn out as well in midterm elections, and so they are desperate to do something like the Tea Party. The Tea Party took what if you're not familiar with just voting trends, voting patterns in the United States over the last several decades, conservative Americans are just more likely to turn out and vote. They're more like, and I mean, look, these are just the facts, right? This is not just my opinion. This is the reality of voting patterns in America. Conservatives take their duty to vote, it would appear, somewhat more seriously. They actually turn out in midterm elections at a higher rate relative to what happens in presidential elections, right? And that's why there are some swing districts. I used to live in a district like this in another state where every presidential election a Democrat would win, and every off-year election, a Republican would win, because conservatives just were more likely to turn out vis-a-vis liberals in the off-year, less exciting elections. Actually makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you're a progressive liberal, you want all the power to be in Washington, D.C. You believe in a dear leader who's, the politician who's going to save your soul. And so it makes a lot of sense that the presidential election is particularly motivating for people on the left. It actually fits with their ideology, right? Whereas conservatives tend to be more interested in local government, less starry-eyed, hopefully, about the presidency. And so there you go. I want to say this, Kevin. We're going to talk about the fact that what's going on in Washington, D.C. is actually very similar in a way to what's going on in Oklahoma City. And what's going on in Oklahoma State Capitol is very similar in one sense to what's going on in Washington, D.C., even right now. Because there is a sense in which both of these, the Oklahoman yesterday said that we have a budget impasse in Oklahoma. We have a budget, which I thought was interesting because we have a state budget. It may be out of balance, although it may also come into balance by the end of the fiscal year. And of course, it was thrown out of balance by the fact that the governor demanded an illegal tax increase on tobacco products, which had to be thrown out by the state Supreme Court. So anyhow, we've covered all that ground in the past. But it is, we'll get to the similarities. A couple more things about the federal shutdown. Of course, it's day one. The news is at noon there's going to be a vote in the Senate. I mean, what's really awkward about this for the left is they support funding the government, right? And yet they are the ones blocking. I mean, it's basically all this is happening on party line votes or very close to party line votes in Washington, D.C., with Republicans voting to continue funding the government, continue keeping the government open, and Democrats voting against it, even though Democrats say they're for it, which is a little bit of a challenging position to be in. There are two questions. One is, will they just, who's gonna cave? But I don't even know what that means on the Republican side. I think that's part of the strength of the Republican position is I'm not sure they know what they would have to give up in order to quote unquote cave, in order to give up enough that Democrats would give in. I think that's an interesting question to ask yourself, and there's something similar about that happening in Oklahoma City and Oklahoma State Capitol. I'll get to in just a minute. The State of the Union address is coming up, and the real test for the Trump presidency is, can they actually? I mean, past presidents. I talked about this a little bit last week, but past presidents have been able to use a government shutdown. I mean, I think Mick Mulvaney last week said that Obama weaponized the government shutdown. I think I've said that before as well. And of course, Bill Clinton famously won a lot of the PR battle with Newt Gingrich and the Republicans in the House back in the mid-'90s. The question is, can the Trump administration pull off something like that? And of course, the State of the Union is coming up, but it's later in the month, I think, than it usually is. It's January 30th is the State of the Union address. The president on Friday, gave a reminder of the fact that he can give a good speech. He can give a good speech that sounds good not just to people who are diehard Trump fans, but sounds good to a lot of Americans. Let's play a little clip from the president's actually somewhat historic speech to the March for Life last week, given that most presidents, even supportive presidents, have literally phoned it in, sort of made a phone call speech. The president actually came out of the White House and spoke to people who were there at the March for Life. Let's listen into that.
Life, and this is a truly remarkable group. Today, tens of thousands of families, students, and patriots, and really just great citizens gather here in our nation's capital. You come from many backgrounds, many places, but you all come for one beautiful cause: to build a society where life is celebrated, protected, and cherished.
So is the president as great an orator as some other presidents have been? I would say no. That's my opinion of Donald Trump. I don't think he's a great orator, but he can give a good speech. Giving a speech there from a teleprompter, obviously the State of the Union will be a similar kind of speech, and So the president has opportunities to try to take control, or at least use the bully pulpit in this whole shutdown situation. We'll see. We'll see. Even today, the Senate coming in at noon. That is what is that? Less than 3 hours, less than 2 hours from right now. So we will see what happens then, and see if the White House is able to weigh in a way that makes a difference here. How is all this similar to what's going on in Oklahoma? Because here in Oklahoma we have this budget fight. I think in the public there's budget fight fatigue. I think a lot of people have maybe sort of tuned out of all this. I think even some legislators. I've talked to some legislators. I don't know. Nobody's told me what's going to happen. Nobody's told me whether we're really going to come back in, really take votes on anything. They keep asking us, would we vote for this? Will we vote for that? Will we vote for this thing over here? And so I think even in the legislature there is budget fight fatigue. But we still have a kind of a budget fight going on here in Oklahoma. The Oklahoman newspaper yesterday said, what did they say? They said they had an article about the income tax hike proposal that is a part of this big package of tax increase proposals that's being pushed toward legislators. And the Oklahoman said, the revamping of Oklahoma's individual income tax laws is one part of a package of proposals backed by Step Up Oklahoma as a way to resolve a legislative budget impasse. And then, to their credit, they go on to acknowledge raise nearly $800 million in new revenue. In other words, $800 million tax hike, a massive tax increase by any standard, and fund a teacher pay raise. And then they make a mention here of altering the structure of state and county government. That is kind of tacked on to this tax increase plan. Look, do we have a budget impasse in the great state of Oklahoma? Do they have a budget impasse in Washington, D.C.? Not really, right? In Washington, D.C., right, nobody's... I pointed this out last week in a kind of a different context. Nobody's against spending more money. Well, okay, there are some real conservatives in both places who are against spending more money. Pretty much everybody is in favor of growing government. It's a question of how you do it and how much, right? And the federal government can continue to... the debate is not over the budget. The debate is over immigration. The debate is over spending more money. And how you, it's really over how you spend more money. Republicans, for the most part, want to spend more money. Democrats want to spend more money. They want to spend more money on different things. And they're arguing over how they're going to reconcile the different things they want to spend more money on. And then immigration, right? It's not really a budget impasse. And here in Oklahoma, it's even, we have a state budget. And as I said, maybe a little bit out of balance, but that budget is coming more and more into balance as the economy gets better. And again, everybody basically agrees on the priorities. The only question is how you do it. And the problem in both cases is you have people out there on the extremes, on the big government side. And look, it's not partisan, but it is ideological, right? You have people in both places who want to grow government as much as possible. And in Washington, D.C., they want a lot of things on immigration that are simply untenable. The American people don't want it. The White House doesn't want it. They're not going to happen. And here in Oklahoma, we have people who have said, yeah, we want to increase taxes, but we only want to increase this tax, or we'll only vote for an increase in this tax if it's as high as we want. This kind of silliness. The gross production tax is a good example. I'll use that just as an example, as long as you'll hang with me and agree. It's just an example. It's not unique to this, because some people then say, well, it's just about oil. No, we have the same thing on income taxes, and we've seen similar things on sales taxes. You have people on the gross production tax saying, we'll only vote for an increase if it's X percent. At one point, I think it was 4%, and then it was, when people started saying, well, maybe we'll vote for 4%, then it was 5%, now it's 7%. You have people out there saying it has to be 7%, right? Those are people who, and it'd be useful if we had some people in the media who are savvy enough to figure this out and do some reporting on it. Those are people who do not want a solution, right? They benefit from an impasse. We have people in Washington, D.C., we have people in Oklahoma City. They benefit from chaos, right? They benefit from disorder. They benefit from not having a budget. That's what's going on in D.C., right? Nancy Pelosi's standing up there, and she goes on. We didn't play the whole clip because that would be inhumane. But Nancy Pelosi talking about immigration reform, anybody on that side of the aisle talking about immigration reform in Washington, D.C. is crazy that they get away with that at this point after creating and sort of incubating that the problems with immigration. We have this immigration system with all kinds of craziness, all kinds of things that work out poorly for American workers, work out poorly for people who come into this country. Everybody knows that. And despite that, we've never been able to come to a solution because every time people come to the table and get serious about it, you have folks out there on the left who move the ball because they get political power from the issue. And we have the same thing in Oklahoma City, especially when it comes to some degree when it comes to raising the gross production tax, as I just described, and also on teacher pay, right? I mean, people still, I don't even say it that often because it's so hard to get people to believe it, despite the fact that it's the truth. But it was the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, that's where I am right now, that was the only group a couple of years ago lobbying for a teacher pay increase at the legislature. Because David Boren and in all of the education status quo groups, they wanted to do it by initiative. You remember the big David Boren sales tax increase? They wanted to do it that way. They didn't want the legislature to do it. They didn't want the legislature to get credit for it. They didn't want because a lot of the people out there, frankly, lobbying for bigger government, higher taxes, and using teachers to do it, right? They didn't want Republicans in control of the legislature to get credit for it. So they weren't that interested in it actually happening. They were okay if it happened a certain way. And of course, when they took it to the polls, the voters actually annihilated that big tax increase proposal. But they want to be able to have these kind of headlines, right? Teacher salary increase remains hot button issue. Actually, online, I think we have the story. We can pull it up. The online story. The online headline for the same story is Oklahoma teachers continue wait for pay raise a decade after last increase, which is a totally disingenuous headline for two different reasons. But look, there are the people out there who say in the shrillest voice that they support teacher pay increases are the people who have perpetuated this debate, perpetuated this impasse. We'll use that word since the Oklahoman likes that word. For years now, right? Because they benefit from it. That's where their political power comes from. And if teachers got a pay raise in Oklahoma, ask yourself, who would lose power, right? Who would have less to talk about? It's not conservatives, right? It's not conservatives. Conservatives are trying to keep government small, trying to rein government in, right? I mean, conservatives can support a pay raise for government employees, and most of them do from the folks I've talked to. Right, but that's not how they get their power, right? That's not how they raise money. That's not how they get political support. So ask yourself, who is it who actually gets political power, gets money, gets political support from this debate continuing? And this story is disingenuous for two reasons. All right, this at least the headline in the print version is teacher salary increase remains hot button issue. That's not misleading. That's public opinion polls show that's true. But the online headline is Oklahoma teachers continue wait for pay raise a decade after last increase. Which is now look, Ben Felder, who wrote the article, he doesn't write the headlines, so I can't blame him for the headline. But it is a little bit ironic since he just had a story in the Oklahoman, and we spotlighted this last week about the fact that there are lots of districts in Oklahoma that pay not lots, maybe there are at least a number of districts in Oklahoma. He highlighted the 5 top districts for teacher pay in Oklahoma. The legislature does not give teachers a pay raise other than by moving up the floor, the minimum salary schedule for teachers. That's all the legislature does, right? Individual school districts are free to make budgetary decisions to pay teachers more, and before people say, well, they can't, the legislature doesn't give them enough money. Well, how do they do it in these districts where they do pay teachers more than the minimum salary schedule? The other really ironic thing, I love this. I can't imagine this was intentional. I know you probably can't read it here, but this is the only way for me to show you. When you go to the jump in this story, well, actually, they even have a little box here. I know you can't read it, but it says inside, see how much the highest paid public school teacher earns in Oklahoma. And the Oklahoman actually ran the Tulsa World story that we talked about last week I'm really glad they got around to this. So you have in here, you open up the paper, and on one side, you have the tiny violins. I mean, look, legitimate complaints, right? But you have this misleading story that suggests that only the legislature can raise teacher pay. And on the other side, on the facing page, you've got the story about, in case you weren't with us last week, you have the story about Epic Charter School. And here's what it says. Its highest paid teacher earns $106,324. That's a special education teacher who earns six figures, a public school teacher. This is a public school teacher in Oklahoma who teaches special ed. You think they value special ed at Epic Charter School? Have you ever heard people, these charter schools, they do everything they can to not have to take special ed students? No, actually, as it turns out, charter schools oftentimes look like they have fewer special ed students because they don't classify as many students as special ed because, well, they can't get away with calling students special ed when those students are actually flourishing in their schools. But they pay six figures to a special ed teacher and $95,440 for a regular education teacher. And the average, let's see, where'd it go? The average, it says here, the state's largest virtual charter school is now using the draw of pay ranging from $64,000 on average up to more than $106,000 for its highest earners to lure applicants. Let me give you one other. We glossed over this last week. I've got it. Let me give you one other really cool line in this story. Quoting one of these highly paid teachers, here's another thing it says. Talking about the hiring process for Epic Charter Schools. She says the steep competition was evident in the multiple detailed interviews she went through 2 years ago. That's to get her job. And she says this. Do you think working in a more rigorous workplace where you're rewarded for merit, do you think that's good for people's self-esteem, good for people's job satisfaction, or bad? Right? If you understand anything about human nature, you know the answer to that question. Here's what this teacher says, quote, "It is the most rigorous hiring process I've ever been through," she said. "It was nice. It makes you feel kind of elite." So, we have some public schools in Oklahoma who figured this out, where teacher pay is they're not waiting decades for a teacher pay increase. They're not complaining to the legislature, asking the legislature for more money, even though they get less money than the rest of the public schools. And as I said last week, I understand they have some things that they can do in those kind of charter schools that are harder to do or impossible to do in other schools. But look, some people have figured out how to pay public school teachers in Oklahoma a whole lot more. So look, that's where we are. Washington, D.C., Oklahoma. We've got these fake budget impasses in both places. Likely to see a lot more play out this week here on the Trent England Show. We'll keep you as informed as anybody else. We broadcast from as close to the state capitol as anybody does. Nobody else is closer on a regular basis broadcasting to the state capitol in Oklahoma City as we are here. And one of the things that we're going to do as the regular legislative session gets closer is focus on good ideas, bad ideas. And just let you know, there's a lot going on beyond these big tax increase packages being pushed at the legislature. These things aren't likely to happen. Look, we're gonna keep our eye on it. We're gonna tell you what's really going on. You can trust us. Unlike various journalistic outfits, well, there's only one I can think of, journalistic outfits out there that have promised the folks up at the Capitol, well, we can guarantee you'll get good press on this. We have made no such promises here on the Trent England Show. We call it like we see it every single day. And one of the things we're going to do is share with you, outside of all that, good ideas, bad ideas up at the state capitol. And one I want to highlight, and I'm going to give the Oklahomans some love here because we've been critical. They deserved it, but we've been critical of them lately. But great editorial in the Oklahoman this morning pointing out this, and it's, there are a couple things they don't say that I want to say here. The Oklahoman pointing out that there's a bill introduced by State Senator Ron Sharp, who is the state senator who compared school choice, who compared parental rights in public education to Nazism. That's who Ron Sharp is. You probably remember that flap last year. So he has this, and he claims to be this great supporter of public education, but he's a believer in, as far as I can tell, I don't know the man, but as far as I can tell, he believes really strongly in top-down political control. He doesn't want parents making choices in public education. He wants politicians controlling the educational system process in Oklahoma. He's very, very firmly dedicated to that, and a somewhat effective advocate. Although, comparing his opponents to Nazis probably didn't help him there. But look, he believes what he believes, and he is responding to some of the criticism of some public schools, and this is not, we don't want to paint with a broad brush, but there have been a number of stories in Oklahoma about inappropriate relationships between teachers and students in public schools. And we've talked about that. I've talked about this on the radio program, the erstwhile radio program, before. And one of the things we always point out when we talk about problems like that, not just that, but problems like that in public schools, is you have a problem. Most public schools don't treat teachers as professionals, right? They don't have a meritocratic system, right, where you're rewarded for excellence, you're rewarded for following the rules and then achieving excellence, right? We know it's really hard to fire people in your average public school, and all of that tends to create, it doesn't create good things. And if we want more accountability in public schools, it's not about layering on the red tape. It's about allowing more choices for teachers, more choices for students, for families. That's what will increase the accountability, the best kind of accountability in public education. But somebody like Senator Ron Sharp, that cuts against his ideology, right? He's not going to do that, so he has a solution. And the Oklahoman, to their credit, call him out on this. Senate Bill 899 would just add another mandate on teachers, right? It would add a mandate on teachers that they have to go through professional development training about inappropriate relationships with teachers. And the Oklahoman is absolutely right here. They say, what an insult to the vast majority of teachers who have never done anything like this, would never do anything like this, right? You're going to make them sit through something like this that is a waste of their time, is one more drain on their on at least their time, which is the scarcest resource that we have. And it's probably not going to make any difference anyway. Right? And so credit to the Oklahoman for calling that out. It's a terrible idea. On the other hand, Representative Mark LePac, and this from the McCarville report, they highlighted this. I'm just going to pile on with them this morning. The McCarville report has this Representative Mark LePac package of legislation to restructure parts of the executive branch to put more power in the governor's hands. And I know people out there say, wait a second, have you seen our governor? Right? You want more power in the governor's hands? Right? Are you paying attention, Trent? And look, I'm paying attention. And people get it that argument gets it exactly 180 degrees perfectly wrong. If we want better governors in Oklahoma, if we want governors who are more competent, more effective, do a better job, we need a governor's office that actually has real power to do things, where there's real responsibility, and frankly, where the people who go to work in a governor's office aren't just there because they're sycophants, aren't just there because they don't have anything else to do. Right? I'm not saying that's how everybody is in the governor's office. But look, when the governor has so little control over so much of Oklahoma's executive branch, right? It's not a place that attracts people who want to reform government, who want to roll up their sleeves and do something. Right? When people from day one are sort of talking about, maybe not day one, maybe within the first couple of years, right? It's legacy, it's image, it's damage control, right? And they have little power, which means that if you dig into things, you take a lot of risk. I mean, the governor's office, I don't want to make excuses for anybody either. The governor's office could have gone after the situation in the health department when they first knew that there were things going on there that weren't quite right, which is years ago. It's going to come out that it was years ago. It's just a question of whether it was several years or more like 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, this goes back a long way, and we are going to find out, you mark my words, we're going to find out that the governor's office could have done something about this a long time ago, but it's high risk because they don't have enough control to make sure, right, the governor would have to use the bully pulpit, the governor would have to work with legislators, the governor would have to work with the Board of Health. It's higher risk than it needs to be. Right? It's harder than it needs to be for governors in the great state of Oklahoma to actually reform things, actually make a difference, and for, to be held responsible by we the people. So Representative Mark LePack, I mean, I'm guessing this guy's been reading the Federalist Papers because he gets it. If we want better government in Oklahoma, we need to know where the buck stops. We need to know who actually is in control of these things and not have these boards and commissions and appointed people who stick around for 7, 8, 9 years, right? So that you have people appointed by the last governor, even when a new governor's not a new governor anymore. They're in their second term in office, and they're dealing with people who were appointed years and years ago, or they're dealing with people who are going to outlast them. That's crazy. So good for Representative Mark LePack. Excited to see. There seems to be a lot of interest in this. I think there are a lot of people who recognize executive branch dysfunction in the great state of Oklahoma. So we got some good ideas. We got some bad ideas. We'll keep highlighting those probably every day on the program. If you have suggestions, go to the Facebook page and comment on the video and drop your suggestions in there. And also, if you go to either Facebook or YouTube, wherever you want to go, after the show wraps up, I take links to all the stories that we talk about on the air, and I drop those links into a comment under the video so you can find all that, you can share all that, you can find the stories. Definitely looking still for your feedback. This is the first kind of official day. We were on the air last week, but this is the first day post-radio program, the new Trent England Show, live on Facebook, live on YouTube, every weekday at 9 a.m. Unless I'm out of town, that's going to happen actually already later this week, but pretty much every day live at 9 a.m. And glad to have you with us. Thanks for watching.